Bootstrap's grid paradigm should allow you to create just about any layout that you can possibly think of, and the predefined media query breakpoints should allow you to achieve those layouts on just about every device available today. And so what we want to do is start by looking at the sizes for those media query breakpoints and compare them in version 4 versus version 3 of Bootstrap. Then I want to talk about kind of how it all works under the hood with viewports and media queries. And then I want to talk briefly about if you took a look in any of the work that we've done, there's this meta tag, view name equal viewport, content equals, and all this stuff, and how that's related to working with these media query breakpoints on mobile devices, why they exist, and we'll kind of go from there. So we're going to talk about a lot of conceptual things in this lesson. Let's start by looking back here at our Bootstrap 4 alpha version of the documentation, and I'm going to scroll down to the grid options, and this will show us the breakpoint sizes in pixels. So in other words, for an extra small media query breakpoint to apply, we'll need a screen size that's 544 pixels or smaller. And actually, when I say screen size, I mean viewport, and I'll explain the difference here in just a moment. And so whenever the viewport is 544 pixels or smaller, then anything you define with the class prefix call-xs- will be applied. And so this would be call-xs-1, -2, -3, all the way up to 12, right? And in addition to that, you can see that we have a breakpoint between extra small and small. So if it's greater than 544 pixels, but less than 768, then the small media query breakpoint will apply. So anything you've defined here, and if you've not defined it, then anything that you've defined in the previous breakpoint will apply. And that goes all the way up to, we get to the extra large at 1200 pixels. Now I want to compare this grid here in version 4 versus version 3. So I'm in the documentation now for version 3 of Bootstrap. And you'll note that the numbers start at, or kind of the difference between extra small and small is 768. And then medium is 992, large is 1200. And if you compare that, you can see that 768 is no longer the difference between extra small and small. It's actually now moved up all the way to medium. And then large and extra large is now the largest at 1200 pixels. So what was formerly a large device is now just an extra large device. What was formerly a medium device is now a large device, and so on. So they basically carved out space for this new extra small form factor, and this would be used for phones, obviously. So it gives us a little more control at that lowest end. And it's important to keep in mind that these breakpoints, these pixel values, are not arbitrary, but they're really based on some research that's been done regarding what most devices are using. So the extra small and the small are really intended for mobile devices. The medium really intended for mid-size, including tablet, and then large and extra large are going to be for desktop machines. All right. Now you can see this little grid behavior row beneath it, and this is kind of saying what I said in the previous video, just in a different way, where you start off with all of the columns you defined collapsed in a given row, or I should say all the cells collapsed in a given row, but then they will become horizontal whenever you hit these breakpoints. All right, so it's just saying it in a slightly different way. Whereas if you define the extra small, they'll be horizontal. Each cell will be horizontal at all times. Finally, the other thing in this grid that I want to point out are whenever you are in a fixed container width, that these are the actual fixed container widths. So if you're in the medium breakpoint, then the width of the entire container will be 720 pixels. Large will be 940, extra large 1140. Obviously, if you're an extra small, there will be no container width at all because they'll take up the full amount of space available. Okay. And then finally, I guess the other thing is that you want to be aware that there are 15 pixels of padding on either side of a given cell. This says column, but remember I'm making a differentiation between a cell and a column. So for any given cell, there will be 15 pixels padding on the left and the right. We'll talk about nestable and offsets and column ordering a little bit later, but as you can see, they apply no matter what. Okay, so what if these breakpoints sizes don't work for you? You can always modify them. If you scroll down a little bit, you can reset the variables inside of SAS and change those breakpoint sizes, and then recompile the SAS source down to CSS, and you should be good to go. All right, so next up, let's go ahead and let's get rid of these, and let's talk about how media queries actually work. And so media queries work by responding to changes in the size of the viewport currently. And the viewport is the size inside of the web browser. So as I resize my web browser, I'm using this little website, viewportsizes.com/mine, to tell me what the actual pixel sizes are. So 766 width by 465 height, and I can obviously modify that or bring it down as small as it'll possibly go in the Edge browser. Okay. And so the viewport is only the visible area of the page. So for example, any given web page, you might have to scroll around using horizontal and vertical scroll bars. The portion that you currently can view inside of those scroll bars is the actual viewport. All right. So it does not include any of the Chrome on any of the given sides of the browser itself. It's only that portion that's in the middle. So that doesn't include this or the tabs above it. And it doesn't include if there's any Chrome on the left or the right either. Okay. So as the viewport changes, CSS will evaluate a series of definitions that you can create called media queries. And I found this great article discussing media queries out on Mozilla's own developer network. I felt like this was probably the best that I was able to find quickly. And so the syntax is pretty simple. Each media query consists of a media type as well as one or more expressions expressed as media features. So a media type, and if we scroll down to this this part, let me see if I can get the actual navigation here on the side. Yeah, the media types include either all, which I think is the default, or things like Braille, or a handheld device, or a printer, or a projector, or a television set. But in most cases, it's going to be, since we're working on in web development, it's usually going to be just a screen, whether that screen is on a phone or on a desktop. However, you can just leave it blank and it will be used in all situations. But if you need to get that specific, like for a television set, you want a different media query to be applied, then you certainly could do that. And then you combine that with some sort of media feature, which is typically width or min width, but can be any of these, including things like aspect ratio or colors, whether there's a minimum or maximum color count. So if this were, for example, to be a certain type of television screen, we might change up the colors if it's monochrome. Okay. And there are some others for monochrome as well. But let's go ahead and define a quick media query. So here, I'm going to create a new file for our project. In the Bootstrap 4 course, I'm going to select project, add new item, HTML page, and I'm going to create something called media query example, or just media query, like so. And I need to paste what I have on my clipboard there. Let me grab the template and let me replace almost everything except for that media query. Here, let's go, and what I'll do here is actually use that media query definition, and I'll tell you what we're going to do. We'll actually grab this and put it here, just so you can kind of see how it's going to be used. And let's go ahead and get rid of all of our references to Bootstrap in this case, and all of the jQuery and Bootstrap.js references as well. All right, and this is a very crude example, but hopefully it'll serve our purposes. Let's go ahead and, well, first of all, notice what we've done. We've created a media query and say for all devices, because we didn't specify anything, whenever the width is at least 700 pixels, then I want to define this particular class called cell. And what will we do when we are less than 700? Well, then we won't even acknowledge that this actually exists. So let's go ahead and run the application. And so you can see we're probably greater than 700 pixels right now. Of course, we could take a look and see, yeah, we're at 833. But what if we were to move this to like 598 is good. Then, okay, we've lost all of our formatting. So the cell style that we defined only works when we're greater than 700. And so that's really what's going on with a media query. It only applies the styles that you define inside of the media query based on the media type and some other media feature. So, for example, minimum width. You can also stitch some together using logical operators like the AND operator and so on. And there's just so much information here that we probably would never need. The good news is that if we use Bootstrap, we don't have to worry about that. But this is what's going on essentially under the hood, is that Bootstrap is defining a bunch of these for each and every individual media query, okay? That's how viewports and media queries work. There is one exception to the rule, however, and that's with regards to mobile devices. So mobile devices don't really know that you intend for your web page to be viewed on a mobile device by default. You have to tell it that you intended for this web page to be viewed on a mobile device. By default, it'll assume that every web page on the internet, unless it's told differently, it'll assume that your given phone will assume that the web page was intended to be viewed at 980 pixels wide. So it was intended to be viewed on a desktop. So that's why sometimes when you go to a website, the text is super small. You see the perfect representation of the web page's width at the expense, however, of viewability, because the text is so small. What they've done is maybe there's only 400 pixels of width on your given phone screen, and it intends for it assumes that the web page was intended to be viewed at 980, so it will zoom out from the web page so that it can fit it all within the width of your device as you hold it in portrait mode. If you intended to handle that scenario, you have to tell the device that, don't worry, I've created my web page in such a way that your web browser will be able to view it without having to do any zooming out in order to present it correctly to the end user. So in order to provide that information to the device, Apple gave developers this meta name equals viewport, and the intent is for you to set these two values, the width of the page as well as your intended initial scale at which it should be viewed. And as time went on, they've added some other things, but let's just talk about these two pieces of the puzzle here. You could say, hey, my page is intended to be viewed at 400 pixels wide, in which case that tells the device, oh, okay, well, I'm 400 pixels wide. I guess I don't have to zoom out in order to accommodate you. Now, typically you don't do that. You would just set it to the device width. And essentially what this says is, how wide are you? Oh, you're 400 pixels wide. Oh, that's perfect. That's exactly how wide my web page was intended to be viewed at. All right. And then you can also provide this initial scale. So you're essentially saying at 1, it's a 1-to-1 ratio. Don't zoom out, don't zoom in. It's perfect, right? Just leave it right where it's at. All right. You can use, I think, a 2-to-1 ratio would say that you need to shrink the size of the web page, so you need to zoom in, whereas a 0.5 means I need to zoom out. All right. I could be wrong and have those reversed, but it doesn't really matter because almost everybody leaves it at this scale. And this is what tells a mobile browser to don't do any fancy scaling. We'll handle everything with Bootstrap, okay? Now, having said all of that, and despite the fact that this has become the industry standard, and it's become an accepted practice, and it's utilized in many different browsers and devices, this entire system is fundamentally flawed for several different reasons. First of all, as is the case with most things related to the internet, different browsers implemented Apple's idea differently. So the reason why that happened, however, was because there was no standard that defined it, which is really the second reason why it's fundamentally flawed. It was not part of any standards body specification. Now, the W3C refused to accept this as a standard. Instead, they defined their own standard, and the rationale is actually pretty sound. But I'll talk about that in a moment. The new standard is called the CSS Device Adaptation Standard. And Microsoft at some point said, I tell you what, we're tired of getting hammered by everybody about specifications and not being compliant with industry standards. So I tell you what, we're only going to implement anything the W3C says, and that's it, final. So they're actually one of the few that adopted that specification immediately, as opposed to the non-specified version, this meta tag that Apple introduced. And so the argument is that the viewport and everything related to the viewport meta tag is really intended to be used for layout and styling, and that viewport information really belongs in CSS since it's related to styling, not in the HTML, because HTML is supposed to only contain the content, right? We remember that from our from what we've learned about HTML5 and the separation between content and layout. But basically, the CSS device adaptation is the same exact idea as what you see here. It's just presented in more of a CSS style. So here, I'll just paste in a quick example, and it would look something like this. Let me format it over here. All right, so this is essentially the equivalent of everything you see here, okay? Now, it's typically not just used by itself like that. It's typically used like so. So here I'm just going to paste another quick example, and it's used inside of a media query. So in this case, whenever the media type is screen and whenever the maximum width is 400 pixels or less than 400 pixels, then apply this viewport. So essentially in this scenario, this is going to be viewed on a screen on a phone. So make sure to tell the phone that we're not expecting it to do any zooming for us because we've already accounted for it. All right. Now, sometimes you'll see a vendor specific styling. So that's usually the case whenever you're working with either Microsoft, which was one of the first ones to implement it, or one of the others. So you might see something more like that instead of this, just because we added on the Microsoft vendor extension. If we take a look and see what Bootstrap does, it actually uses these. So let's go @-ms-. You can see that it has created that viewport, setting the width equals device width for all Microsoft devices, Mozilla, and WebKit, which is Apple as well, which seems to have adopted it. And then it has the non-vendor specific version of it. Eventually, these can all be removed once everybody adopts it. And here again, caniuse.com is really something that you want to take into consideration if you were to kind of do this stuff yourself. Again, the great news is you don't have to. Bootstrap's already figured this out, so you're good to go. Okay. But at any rate, let me go ahead and I'm going to comment all of these things out because they really don't mean anything in this context. Like so. Okay. So, all right, we covered a lot of ground. Hopefully it all made sense. But the main takeaway here is that Bootstrap has done a lot of work around media queries, creating breakpoint sizes that are correct for the kind of devices that we'll most often work with. We talked about how viewports and media queries actually work and how you can define styles inside of a media query, which is essentially what Bootstrap's doing. And then we talked about how mobile devices know that you're actually not intending for them to zoom in or out of your web page, but instead that you intend for it to be handled by your own code, in this case, Bootstrap. And we looked at the CSS device adaptation specification, which allows us to replace that non-standard stuff with good old W3C standards. Okay, so that just about does it. Next video, I want to talk about the various ways in which sizes are represented in Bootstrap and talk about specifically relative ems or rems. And we'll start that in the next lesson. See you there. Thanks.